Today we're going to talk about Liger Mobile, hybrid apps in general, how things relate to Cordova and PhoneGap, which some of you have already heard a little bit about if you were in the last session, and how things differ or what can be improved upon. I call this talk Hybrid App Development for the Pragmatic Perfectionist, and hopefully in a few minutes you'll see why. The Liger team, these are a few of us who've worked on the project. That's me at the top, a barbecue hacker. Started off as coding as a kid. I've pretty much done it my entire life. I tend to specialize in more the front end and mobile development side of it nowadays. But you know, just recently for the Liger project, I've pushed both iOS and Android code. So I've certainly dabbled enough. These are some of the other guys. You should follow them all. You can follow the whole project anytime we push a new version up at Liger Mobile Devs. We put it out there so that everyone knows that's where it's gone to. What is Liger Mobile? So Liger Mobile is a hybrid app framework for mobile development. What happened was this. If you were in the last session, you learned a little bit about what hybrid apps are, or PhoneGap or Cordova. Everybody in here semi-familiar with those terms? I'm going to use them semi-interchangeably the whole time because one's just the open source project of the other. I work for a company called ReachLocal. About a year and a half ago, a little more than that, our management team came to us and said, hey, mobile team, you guys are building the new mobile app for the company. We're like, great, that's what we do. They said, okay, here's the deal though. All of the UI code has to be completely shared between iOS and Android because we don't want to hire any more devs. Or, you know, like that being a business reason, you know, like we already have a core team. We already have so many web developers, we want to make use of their talents. We don't want to hire more specific siloed team members. That makes sense? And that makes sense, and a lot of businesses do that. And we were like, okay. I had built some PhoneGap apps in the past. We have an extremely talented iOS and Android guy, so I thought, if it's possible, I'm sure they can do it. John, the iOS guy, has literally been working on mobile phones since before they existed, as I understand it. Like, he was from Sweden and was part of the team where they're like, hey, we're going to build mobile devices, we're going to build these things called cell phones, go and build us an operating system. Yeah, you may get one of those phones to try it on in like 3 or 4 years. You know, here's the chip, have fun. And so he's pretty good at his job. But what happened was, we built the app, solving a lot of the problems along the way that I and John felt existed with Cordova / PhoneGap. Mainly those problems being user experience related. Who in here is an iPhone user? Okay, more than half. The rest Android? Any Windows guys in the room? That's what I figured. All right. In iOS and in Android, as a user, we have very specific and very high standards for what we expect apps to do. That's been that way since the iPhone came out. I mean, it felt like magic. And we expect the screens and the interactions and the animations and all these things to work in a very particular way, and we instantly notice when things don't. And this has been the real stopping point for hybrid applications. Building a PhoneGap or Cordova app, I can pretty much tell in a couple of seconds that you did. And for people who were in the last talk, when we did the kitchen sink app, did you notice that the title bar was that blue color and the back button was square and when you clicked it, it shifted the whole screen and there was a big empty area in between, and I could instantly tell that was not native. And I could tell the header bar wasn't native, and the animation wasn't smooth, and it didn't fade it. If you ever take the iPhone simulator, you can slow it down. You can watch how, when you slide a new screen in, the current title of the page slowly fades out as the other one slowly fades in and slides in from the left. And it's a beautiful thing, and how the back button appears. Does everyone know what I'm talking about? And we expect that to happen. And right now in PhoneGap and Cordova apps, that doesn't happen. And that stops a lot of people from wanting to try creating a hybrid app because you don't end up with the experience you expect. But what happened was, we built the app. A couple months later, we get the chance to build another app for a hackathon, and we're like, hey, we could probably do it, but let's try to take out the pieces that we used to build what we call the Edge app. And what we did was we ended up extracting a whole framework that we now use and we now call Liger that rests on top of the Cordova JavaScript bridge. All right, so what is a hybrid app? A hybrid app today, in most cases, via PhoneGap or Cordova, is simply a native app that makes use of a single web UI view, where you constantly manipulate the DOM. And if you saw in the last session, he had his code up for his demo, and you'll notice it was just one really long HTML file that got hard to navigate. When someone asked him where the camera part was, it was hard for him to find because it was just one very large file for one app. And what happens is you constantly manipulate that DOM to simulate an application. The problem with that, again, is it's just basically a custom browser that doesn't act the way a user expects it to. The good points about hybrid, obviously, are you do have a single code base for your UI between iOS and Android. If you are doing any kind of responsive websites or things like that, you often have a lot of custom branded HTML, CSS that you can make use of instantly and not have to convert to any kind of native components. And it opens up the development to way more developers. Anyone, I think, who does any kind of web dev can create a mobile application. My first one I ever created, I didn't even own an iPhone at the time, and I created it all in HTML. And then luckily one of my friends sold me an old MacBook for $200 that I could just compile it on and, get it into the App Store. But so anyone who's doing web dev can do it. And then it's faster to market because you've completed it a lot faster than you would have. The bad points, basically all the non-native stuff. It essentially boils down to one thing. You are trying to create a non-native experience that the user expects. And if you were in the last session and you watched that, you kind of understand what I'm talking about. Our solution. Here's the big one. If it's going to be hybrid, we had a couple of things that we wanted. One, it should actually be hybrid, meaning I'm a game developer. I develop games in SpriteKit, which is Apple's native game library that you can use. Okay? I really like it. I think it works really well for creating games. What I don't want to do ever in my game code, though, is spend hours upon hours creating a scoreboard, creating a welcome screen, doing all the things that essentially are taking away from my game code. But what we can do with Liger that you can't do with something like Cordova in general is we've made it so you can indiscriminately switch between what we call Liger pages and native pages. So if you know anything about, if you do iOS development anyway, and you want to create a really fast prototype, you could do 10 Liger HTML pages in 10 minutes, and then make the one key component of your app that would be native. You can make a native navigation controller and switch indiscriminately between the two and pass any data you need back and forth so that you don't, no states are lost or anything like that. Does that make sense to everybody? Right now, if you're doing a hybrid app, you're not doing native. You're never putting in those native controls. So it had to be able to switch back and forth between them. It had to have native menuing. It had to have native menu bar, navigation bar. It had to have, the ability to, say, for instance, I open up a form page. Well, in iOS, largely I expect the ability to hit save in the top right. Does that make sense? So it had to do things like that. It had to feel native, and that's the big thing. John, we used to call this slide before this the problems, stuff John doesn't like. He's very much an Apple fanboy, and he very much expects his phone to work exactly the way Apple intended it to work. He has read through those guidelines many, many times, and he adheres to them. And it was with a great amount of joy that we were able to build an app that met his expectations. And that it also needs to provide fully native, things like email, Facebook, Twitter, all the things that are already built in that you already use. So, for this to work, we took basically the exact opposite approach of the standard Cordova workflow. We treat each page as its own separate small application. This allows us to, one, separate all the code by what the page actually does. Instead of having a single large DOM, we have multiple HTML files. And why we do that is, so say I'm on a home page, or I'm in your Twitter app, and I click on a tweet. If you were developing that in Cordova, what you'd then do is you'd rewrite the DOM to show that tweet. How you get it to show, you do some kind of animation, it might look okay. But in native iOS, what the user expects to happen is they tap on it, a new window is created off screen, it slides in, changes the title, shows the screen, everything's good. So that's what we decided to do. We were going to make it, when I click a link, we're going to open a window outside, we're going to pass it all the content we need, we're going to open it, we're going to slide it in fully natively. And so for that, we built the data conduit and some callbacks. All right, you might be interested in this if you're building a server-side, an API, that your app is kind of more showing the data, dashboarding, things like that. If you have kind of a very linear workflow, or if you already have a bunch of, again, if you already have a bunch of code that's already set up for mobile responsive sites. All right, here are the repos. This is a fully open source project. Feel free to play with it. The main one is at github.com/reachlocal/Liger. From there, you can find everything else. We have a common repo that's the go-between between iOS and Android, and then both iOS and Android have their own projects that you can download. And what we're working with today is this Liger Mobile workshop. This code, example code, you can download. Feel free to play with. It has a get step process, so you can start with nothing and build the entire app, or you can skip into individual steps along the way. Just check out step 5 or whatever, and feel free to play with individual portions to learn.
Right, you have the slides at the end.
Yes, and then yep, and then here, this is the workshop on GitHub. You can see it. The README is very long. It takes you through literally copy and paste everything, where to add it, all the Git checkout steps. Very, very simple. What we're going to do now is we're going to jump into some code so I can show you just how easy and just what this ends up looking like. We're going to build a demo app. Anybody in here other than me, like a total BBC fan? Like, I love Sherlock and Death in Paradise and all those shows. You know what I'm talking about. So when it came time to build a demo app, I was surfing around bbc.uk. Turns out their entire site is an API. Just add .json to any page and you get the JSON feed of the page. Awesome. So I was able to create an app basically in about 4 hours that shows a full list of all the upcoming shows. You'll be able to view a specific show's information, view the more information about the series, view all of the upcoming episodes of a series, add and switch favorites, also email the support link for the app, things like that. I'm going to jump into code now, talking a little fast, but at any time, feel free to interrupt me with questions. It doesn't matter really how much we get through, as long as you guys understand what we're doing. But first, I'm going to go ahead and show what, oh my goodness, that looks so bad. Let me see if I can scale that down. Oh, that's already 50%. Oh, let's switch hardware. Oh no. How are we going to do this?
You have to rescale it down.
Command 3. Awesome. Thank you. I didn't know that. Sweet. Okay. So let's go ahead and fire this thing up. So here is the iOS repo that you can download at the workshop. I call this the BBC Mysteries app. Here is an upcoming list. Stylistically, this is just Twitter Bootstrap. I added nothing. There's no. I think there's just a default theme if there is one. So this is the upcoming page. I'm going to go ahead and click into this. What you saw happen there was a new instance of a view controller was created off screen. We passed the data we needed to it about the show. It created it off screen, slid it in, and put it on the stack. So what you got was completely native animations. You got a true separation of code and functionality. And in addition, you can actually then, via the bridge that exists between Safari and Xcode, go in here and play with individual portions of the HTML just for this page. Does that make sense to everybody? So as a debugger, I can debug all of my HTML just like I normally would, like with Google Chrome tools, only in Safari. So let's keep exploring this app. So here we're on a show's details page. I want to see some information about that show, the series in particular. I can click there and go to all the series information. I can add it to a favorites. It's got some news about it down here. It's got a picture. Pretty basic stuff. The one thing I will make a note of here You notice that when I opened this page that there was a little circle and this picture kind of popped into existence. I'm making a live call to the BBC's API right now. If this was my actual app, I would cache all the images, so you would never see that in like real production code. So we can go over here, we can view all the upcoming episodes of this show. We could go and say, oh, and then here's a fully native menu. We could go over here to see, do we have any favorites? Oh, we do have a favorite. We can just view the information about that favorite. Oh, it's got some news as well. So you see, we have a pretty fully featured app here. But how did we get there? And how, I mean, really, I built the app in 4 hours. I think I spent the entire day doing it, but most of it was just surfing the BBC. I mean, that's what it comes down to. So how did we get here? Well, how does Liger work? We created this bridge for iOS and Android to talk to the HTML using Cordova. But then when you open pages, we created this new nomenclature because iOS and Android really don't share any words like verbiage of in terms of like programmatic stuff. We created the term page. So each of those, each time I clicked the link and we opened up something new and then slid into existence, we call that a page. So how the app works is when you create a Liger app, you're going to get this app.json, which is the shared information between iOS and Android. We need to share some information. Here is a list of the pages that we're going to show in that menu. It's just specified out in the app.json. Upcoming, about, favorite, support. In this case, each one of those relates to a corresponding HTML file. All right? Does that make sense, everybody? Because upcoming is the first in this array, it becomes by default the home page of the application. Okay, so that's why when I turn it on, we got the upcoming list. So what happens in upcoming? So in upcoming, we have just standard HTML. We include some assets, Cordova, page and Liger, which we'll get to in a little while. I include jQuery, a bootstrap, underscore, and then an upcoming.js. In our system, just for convention, each page has a corresponding HTML file and a corresponding JavaScript file. So very easy to make the connection of where the code's being executed. On the HTML itself, you'll notice the only thing we have is right here, underscore template, which is just a list of the shows, and a container to put it in, and then eventually we call page.initialize upcoming. So for anyone who's worked with Cordova or PhoneGap before, you know that there is some setup that it needs to do to make connection to the device, to make, to get device-specific information, to make device calls at a native level. So what we did was when we built it on top, we go, okay, we're gonna let Cordova initialize, we're gonna initialize Liger on top of it, and then we create our page object that uses both of these, and that is what you interact with. So when page.initialize is called, you know at that point, Liger and Cordova have already been properly set up for you. Does that make sense? So when we first started developing this was the biggest pain point. When we were told that we were going to build a hybrid app, and we decided that we were going to be doing this opening new pages and keep it all native in terms of navigation and workflow, this was the problem. What you end up finding out is that you get a lot of race conditions when you're trying to do this stuff because you're popping UI web views into existence, you're trying to pass it data, but it's not on the screen yet, or hasn't finished creating yet, or it is finished creating, but Cordova, the system that you use to pass it information, hasn't finished initializing yet. So it took a long time for us to get this right. And now that we finally got it right, it's really very simple. Call page.initialize. I choose to pass it the name of the page that I want to. And so what happens then is in upcoming.js, we have this function that I call page.upcoming that gets called after everything is ready. Now at this point, there's a lot more stuff Liger will do for you. You can add a native refresh icon. You can add a native toolbar. You can get information from if this page had a parent or a child. You can do things like that. So by doing this, by going page.upcoming and making sure that's ultimately what gets called, this is the very top is what's getting called on upcoming.js first, I can add other things to my page. In this case, we're going to go ahead and add a refresh icon so that you can refresh your list. And then once that's ready, we're going to initialize the upcoming object. I typically like to keep my stuff pretty broken up, so I create an upcoming object. And this handles basically all the work for the upcoming page. So once it's initialized, what does it do? Pretty simply, it goes out to the bbc.uk right here, gets all the drama/crime shows from their API. If the fetch is successful, it comes down here. Right there, it builds an array of the shows and the pertinent information about them. Title, subtitle, start date, provider, things like that. At that point, it calls display upcoming, which is this code right here. All that does is pass this information to the underscore template we saw on upcoming.html. It gets rendered, and then we add some click bindings. Everyone used jQuery before? You'll see a lot of jQuery in here, so I tried to pick that pretty common denominator there. So what just happened? We called it, we got the information back, we passed it to our templates, and it showed up on the screen. All right? Well, everybody good so far? All right, so now where does the magic come in? Why is this better than Cordova and PhoneGap? Well, it's this next step. When I click on one of these, I'm faking nothing. I really am creating a new view off the screen. It really is being loaded into native navigation handled exclusively by iOS and Android. You keep the experience the person expects, and you get all the advantages of having written your code. I mean, what was it, 50 lines of JavaScript? That took me probably 20 minutes to throw together that whole page. And then we got to this page. So how did we get here? What magic occurred between here and there? That's all boils down to this link right here. All the show details links call this function. Page, open page. It takes some parameters. First one being details, which is the title we want to give the page. So if we go back over here, you'll see this says details. We can make that say anything we want. We pass it a page name. This is, again, the common nomenclature that we've come up with to speak between iOS and Android, called show. And then we pass some arguments, show, and the information about the show. So what this is pointing to is the location in the array where they clicked. Does that make sense? Okay. So what happens right here? We call the title and we call the page. So what's the page doing? The page, we're passing it as show. So what Liger does is it goes, okay, I'm trying to open a page called show. First thing it does is it looks in your root directory and it goes, is there a show.html? In this case, there is. So we'll use that as the new page. Off screen, it will create a new controller, put that in there, put it in the navigation controller stack, and pass it over. Okay? If that show.html was not there, it would go, do I have a show native view controller that I can use? Did me or John take the time to create one? Or if this was a game, if this was one of my games, I'd be passing it off to the sprite kit stuff at this point. But I can build all the homepage screen or the scoreboard in HTML and save myself a bunch of time. Does that make sense, everybody? So it's completely arbitrary. It doesn't matter. Whereas in PhoneGap Cordova, that's not really an option. So in this case, though, show.html exists. So when we call page.openPage, it loads in show.html to the new controller. It passes an argument called show with the show object that I've created. And then it loads it onto the stack, bringing it in natively. So what happens on show? Well, if we load show.html, which is what's being loaded, you'll see that we load basically the same assets, other than down here we have pages show.js. Again, we have another underscore template for how we're going to render it. We have a place to put it. And then eventually we call page.initializeShow. So on show, how is that magic happening? Well, what's happening? Well, the one thing you'll notice right away is on the show page, even though we're initializing it here, it's not going out to the bbc.uk to get the information it needs to display this page. The reason? It already has it. In our initial call, we got all that information we needed. We then, via Liger, we create, just like you would a get parameter, we create this list of params that can be passed along arbitrarily between any two pages. So when I created the page, I said, create a show object, and here's all the data for it, and pass it to the page I'm opening. So in the initialize function, what I do is I say, hey, does page.args exist? If it does, is there a show element in it. In this case, there is, so it knows already what to do. It just takes those and calls display and add bindings. The only thing display does is it takes that show information, passes it to the HTML so that it displays the title, the subtitle, the short synopsis, provided, all of that stuff, adds a couple of more buttons, and then adds the bindings, and it's done. So in just a few lines of JavaScript, I've created a whole page that now has a bunch of functionality with basically no effort. And it's fully, I mean, I'm here, I challenge anybody to tell me that's not fully native. I mean, we show our app to a lot of people, and I haven't ever really got a response back of, well, that looks fake, because it's not. But I can show old PhoneGap apps that I built, and I get that response. Mainly from my wife, who's like, this is slow. And with this, that's not really a problem. Okay, so what's on this page then? What can we do? Well, we can obviously open up the link to the series, but we have these links down at the bottom called share on Twitter and share on Facebook. So let's see what happens when I click on one of those. So I click share on Twitter, and it says, oh, be sure to watch this. Because that's, and I'm like, okay, so let's go ahead and hashtag it MidwestJS. So I just posted that to my Twitter. So how'd that happen? Did I have to do a bunch of work to make that, to add these functionality? No, because there exists a ton of native controllers that iOS and both Android support. Facebook, Twitter, Map API, Sound, geolocation, you can go down the list, there's a lot of them. And because they're already existing, we have these bindings for Twitter. We can call dialogues as well as new pages, dialogues being the things that pop up. And we call open dialogue with title, which is another thing Liger provides. We can pass it the name Twitter, and we can pass it the page name Twitter. Now, again, Liger goes, is there a twitter.html? No, but there's a Twitter native navigation controller. That is a mouthful. That it can pass to and render just like it does on any other app that you use that accesses Twitter or Facebook. And then I can pass it the text I want to show. Be sure to watch the program title on the date and time. Does that make sense? So one line of JavaScript, full Twitter, Facebook integration. Very simple. Any questions at this point? No? Oh, yeah. Okay. Oh, let's define here. Do you mean this?
Yeah.
Okay, so that's a full native menu that iOS is creating. And it's creating it, we're passing it the page title from the previous page. It's picking it up automatically and adding it. But the menu is a good question. This menu over here, this is fully native as well. As soon as the app starts, it loads in the app.json, and it goes, okay, I'll just run down that list of pages that you have, and then it knows how to open the pages. Now, one thing that's kind of cool is we're saying, all right, so here's that list, that app.json that's shared between Android and iOS, the list of pages. It's building that native menu. But what's cool is we specifically say right here, page app menu. Okay, so, but if we look at the HTML list, app menu is now a page. So it's checking to see if appmenu.html exists. It doesn't, so it goes back to the Liger native app menu view controller and passes those and builds that menu. But if I create appmenu.html, I now control how that menu works and looks. Does that make sense? So just added a bunch of, again, built-in functionality you don't have to worry about, or you can take control of.
You can style the menu.
Yeah. Yep. And in a couple of minutes, I'll show, if we get time, I'll show kind of the fully fledged app, our app in demo mode, so you can see what a very full featured app looks like when it's really styled out and everything. All right, so we're here. We go here. Now we're at the series page. So what just happened again? So on the show page where I click the series information, what is happening? I'm creating a new page. I'm giving it a title of series. I'm giving it a page of series. So it looks over here, and in this case, series.html exists, and we're passing it the program ID, a series ID, because that next page does not have all the information we want it to have. So Series.html gets loaded. The HTML is pretty simple. It's just a bunch of underscore templates. One thing to note here, you do not have to do it this way. Who in here is like an Angular, diehard Angular user? Anybody? Okay, there's always somebody. Backbone. Okay, I've got the same guy. That's weird. Ember. Anybody? I think they're all three are speaking here, right? I'm pretty sure. You can use whatever JavaScript framework you want. We're not opinionated at all on how you choose to run your JavaScript or put your HTML on the page. I happen to use underscore templates in this case simply because I was already bringing underscore in for something else. Okay? And the one thing to note, though, is things like Angular really lend themselves incredibly well to building single-page apps in the browser. All right? We are doing the exact opposite thing here. We are creating a bunch of little apps. So I don't know that it's going to save you any time. And it's probably only going to cause you some headache because when we first did it, I actually took the time. I was like, all right, what can I get it to work with? And we figured out really quickly I can get it to work with anything. But because we have a very specific loading sequence, I had to completely ditch Angular's way of doing it. I can't just attach the app thing to the, was it ng app to the HTML tag, because it looks for that, but it can't load yet. Nothing will work. So I had to completely rework the way it got started to wait until our stuff was ready. And then once I'm at that point, I'm like, oh, the directives and all these things, that's great, but they're just being loaded in at one time and they're not really being reused. And I don't want to build a single page app because that just makes my stuff messy. So you can use anything, but you don't really have to use any of them. And in Angular's case specifically, I actually think it's a little bit of the opposite way. You're making things harder for yourself. So again, we're just loading some underscore templates here. We have a container to put them in, and then again, we call page.initialize series. And so what does series do? Series gets initialized. It looks again in the page.args, this parameter system that we built in. Is there a series ID? If there is, let's go ahead and attach it to this object. And then let's try to get the information about that series. So we call once again out to the API. We pass it the series ID. It gets all the information we need to know to load the show's general information. The general picture, the news, if there are some. One thing about, so here's another feature. So we're going to go ahead and add this one to favorites. Come back to that in a minute. Let me see if I can scale this down any farther. It really doesn't want me to hit that button. If this was a little higher, I could click that link. Because one of the other features that's built in automatically is the browser. And so in this particular case, this news is some outside news from, say, the BBC or some other news source that they've attached to this show. Well, Liger has built-in external browsing capabilities. So right now we're rendering our own HTML, JavaScript, CSS, but say we need to show an external link of some kind, maybe reset password information or whatever that happens to be. You can open that up really very quickly by page, open page, news, and then passing it the page name browser. Again, another native control that you don't have to build, that you don't have to work on, that you don't have to do an HTML file for, that gets built and passed and automatically taken care of. Does that make sense to everybody? So
Safari then, or does it do it within your?
It does it within our app. You have options. Again, you have options. You can do pretty much whatever you want. You can open up as a dialog with a done button. In this case, I just opened it up as a new page, and it would just say browser at the top, and the back button would say series. And then it would go to whatever website you wanted it to go to. And it has, back buttons and all that stuff. We built our own for that, simply because at some point in time, our specific application needed kind of a custom browser. So we put it in everything that we end up building for us, we dump right back into the open source project. So you see a lot of commits, and and a lot of new features being added all the time. One other thing you notice here, so I added that to the favorites. So what happened there? Well, the beauty of being HTML is that I get all the stuff that HTML provides. One of them being local storage, geolocation, all these wonderful new HTML5 features that we read so much about. In this case, I'm just taking the information for that series and creating a local storage object to pass it to, so that I can create a list of favorites. Really easy, no kind of database integration or no kind of complex stuff going on there. Again, nice features that you have because this is an HTML application. And then the last thing this page does is it can call the upcoming episodes, which just render a full list of all the upcoming episodes of the show.
Is there a home button there? I didn't see there.
You can drag the menu at any point to get to the full menu sec. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. And you can drag it back and forth. Works with this page, a lot like the last one, works almost exactly the same. Again, we take in the page, we get the details from the API, we call, we display it, we got the links. Really simple way to build a really nice, complex application in HTML. If you've used PhoneGap and Cordova before, the main thing I want to take away is you can use PhoneGap and Cordova very quickly to build an HTML-based application. I have done it, I have enjoyed it, it has worked for me. What you do not end up with, though, is, again, the user experience that your users expect. And it's, in my opinion, it's absolutely no more work to do it like this and to get all of that as a bonus. We built it because we had the need to build kind of a nice enterprise-level application in a way that we could share all of the UI code between our Android and iOS. Now, if I fired up my Android simulator, I won't because at this screen size it would look absolutely terrible, I think. You would see that it has its own. Okay, so for instance, here, you know, in iOS you often get the back button and things like that. We take into account all of Android's UX features or ideas. We don't do back buttons in Android. You have a back button. People are used to using the back button. Does that make sense?
So how does this scale to a desktop, or is this just an app?
This one right here is just an app.
Okay.
So I could certainly, if the screen allowed, I would open it up to an iPad and you'd see it in an iPad and it's fully responsive. I would probably change the series page around a little bit if this was going to be launched, which, by the way, I'm obligated to say, on our About page you notice, it's not endorsed anyway by the BBC. This app is something I built. Don't use it. But feel free to play with the workshop. Just don't launch it into the App Store or the Play Store or anything like that. In the workshop, this is actually step one, so you don't miss it. So, so does everyone understand that, like, I guess the value proposition of using something like Liger on top of Cordova? That's the main thing I want to get across.
Well, here we had to sell that we're doing an app and a responsive site.
Yep. Yep.
Wouldn't do that, but it does seem that this is more intuitive and easy to support, right? 80% of your time to support.
Yeah. For us, it was, we knew we were building an app. So we went to, the complete, if we're going to do it, might as well do it right kind of thing. Mobile responsive websites, I am all for. I do them all the time. I think everyone should have a responsive site if you have a fully featured site, because I think, the scaling in Safari and all that stuff, it makes for just horrible user experience. A little bit about kind of like why I have the mentality I do is I coded for a long time, went to college, learned, got degrees in coding, and then coded for a year. And then eventually what happened is I went for a coding job interview. I'll never forget this. Drove there, took the interview, thought the interview went incredibly well. Guy calls me back, the owner of the company, calls me back later in the night. He's like, hey, I want to offer you a job. I'm like, sweet, but I don't want you to be a coder. And I'm like, that's all I know. And he's like, he said, you're one of the few programmers I ever met who could take technical terms and put them in non-technical ways, because he himself was non-technical. He was very much a designer, really didn't know much code. and he'd ask me a lot of technical questions. I guess I'd explained to him adequately enough that he liked it. So he offered me a sales manager position. And a little more than 1 year out of college, I took it. I was a total risk, and my wife totally didn't understand it. It was the single best education I've ever received. I did that job straight for 2 years, and ultimately I moved to Minnesota, and I left it, but I would stay with that company and keep coding for them on all the projects that I'd worked selling and designing and stuff. But for 2 years, I got to see people use my code. Best experience I've ever gotten. If you build code, please go out and watch people use it. You will learn more in 10 minutes with them than you could ever learn by reading Apple's new book or so-and-so's new book or whatever. Because what happened is I would work with a company to develop a product for them, and then work with our designers to convey that client's ideas, and then so on down the chain, and ultimately train that user on using it. And you would be amazed at the different ways people do things. And that 2 years totally transformed my mind as a programmer, and is almost exclusively why since then I've specialized in front end and mobile stuff, because that is ultimately what the person sees, interacts with, and gets the value of the app from. I very much used to be, the back end guy. Can I make this faster? That was all I cared about. Speed, efficiency, what systems I'm using, what frameworks am I using. Your clients don't ever care. And so when we started this app, for me and for John, it was really about, if we're going to do it in what we viewed at the time, very much so, as a subpar both development platform and delivery method for the users, we really wanted it to make it useful and the experience that they ultimately expected. Does that make sense? But again, if you build software, please get in front of the people who are actually using it. It's the best education you'll ever get. I can't stress that enough. One of the just jumping back in here, one of the other things, again, because Liger interprets pages as HTML or native, you can jump to them from anywhere. So for instance, this is a native view controller, as I said, right? This menu, it's built into Liger. It took in the app.json. It then rendered them, and it knew how to do that. And then this last link, the support, what it does is it's one of those built-in features. It's going to call the email feature. So when I click that, it brought up the native email controls. Okay? So I do this to show the fact that at no point in a Liger application are you stuck in one way or the other of thinking. You can jump totally back and forth between HTML and JavaScript and native and HTML and JavaScript, and it all works the exact same way, so that if we go to app.json to see how that happened, again, we see the support is just opening page called email and passing the args, the page args, the same way we would have done it anywhere else.
So is there a native authentication that you plan to do, or do you just do that all?
Because our service is mainly talking to an API, authentication is handled, at that level. But no, we don't have any kind of authentication stuff built in. We've actually, we've thought a lot about, different kind of native level encryption services we could tie in and things like that. Here we're just using local storage to save the data, but an actual tie into each app has its own, you can create it, SQLite and I think iOS and something in Android. You can create, own encrypted databases, and we can pass data back and forth like that. We've thought about that. So yeah, there's so much we could do, and so many different ideas that we've come up with. Authentication certainly being one of them. Yeah. Other questions?
I summed that other question. Do you have any plans to do like native browser binding? I mean, just to make a more regular, plain old mobile web page, because that could very easily be just a regular. It could.
It could. Actually, so in I think 2 weeks, our company has its second annual hackathon. The first hackathon is where this framework essentially got created, and the second one is where I'm planning on building what I'm calling Liger browser? I don't know. Because what we're doing here is when we call page open page, we're making Cordova calls that make a call down to the native code that know what to do. what I'm effectively going to do is create like this shim layer that checks the browser level that you're on. Am I on Chrome? Am I on Firefox? Am I on this stuff? And if it does, then you could render this. Hopefully, in 2.5 weeks, I'd be able to bring this site up in my browser and have it run just exactly the same way. Exactly. It's just a windowed application, changing that and using the native back from the browser and stuff. I've got it worked out a lot in my head, but my head's a scary place, so hopefully it comes out at least somewhat decently. But yes, that is a very good question and something I certainly want to address. Hopefully in about 2.5 weeks that will be done. Good question. Anybody else got a question?
So you package this up as similar to Docker. Yeah, similar to PhoneGap, how you compile it down.
Well, this right here running on the app, that is a dot app. That is a fully compiled iOS app, the same in Android. In our case, we just have we have a build box that we send the stuff to. That it's just I think it's a Mac Mini or something like that. That just has the Xcode tools on it and the Android tools. We just send the code to it, it builds it and stores it. But yeah, they compile down to fully native applications. Other questions? Anybody?
Are you just using Xcode to build this app?
Yes, the only reason I'm in Xcode right now is for 2 reasons. If my screen was bigger, the biggest one being the debugging. I wish that you could see it. So every time I click over this, it just takes over the whole screen. Let's see if I can shrink this stuff down enough for this to be actually useful. Part of my talk is usually doing this. So here we're on the About page. I can go, if I click over here, I can actually open so these are the pages I have open in my stack right now. I can go to that About page, and if I want to play with the HTML or play with the JavaScript, say I want to reinitialize this page, I can actually call About and see what's in it and play with it that way. And this makes debugging so much easier because now I can individually call functions and change the HTML. So I still get all of the things that make me fast at developing HTML here in this style of development. That's the reason I'm launching it from here. I tend to do all of my dev in iOS and Xcode, but all of my coding in Sublime. So I use it just as a run build tool. In the last session, he mentioned that with Android, the emulators are largely ridiculously slow. Bringing them up would do no good here. You do really want to have a phone. I almost never touch Android unless I have our QA guy's stack of Nexus 4s. Then I'll actually test them on the device. But we have very little, basically we have feature parity between the two, and we've never really had a problem on launching it into that. Good question, though. Other questions? So this is just a little example. The one thing I did want to show you before we're done, so that was just a kind of very, very simple app, did very, very simple things, and looked bootstrap enough that you would have thought that was maybe a mobile web page, right? But what does something that's kind of more fully featured and fully thought out look like? So this is the demo mode of our corporate app, and the reason that we ended up building Liger. Here's the dashboard where our clients can view the contacts that they've received. We have some charting at the top. You can open those up and view more information about those. Again, this is all HTML. Just the menuing system in this one's native. We got call information. I can click that, go to the new page, open that call up with native media player or HTML5 media player for that. We can email this person, again, using the native controls that are already there. We can do a timeline, settings, where are they at, things like this. So this is an example of a dialog that we just popped open, and we can close it by doing that. One thing I want to point out here. So anybody, so this person has a status right now of new customer, right? Or a new contact, right? And we've opened a page in the stack. So we've gone to the home page, to a detail page, to this page. So that middle page, that detail page of contact, it's still open, right? It's still open. And it still says new contact. So when I change this, how does it change? One of the things that we thought of was, if I change this here, we go back, it says active lead. How do we do that? All the pages in the stack are connected, and you can call any one of them at any other point in time. So when I can't show you the code for this, but the what's actually being called is in page, we have this system of update parent, update specific pages in the parent stack. When a parent gets updates, if the child updates function is called. So at any point, you can make something at page 10 in a stack affect page 1 and vice versa. Does that make sense to everybody? So in no way is your app limited by, stale data or whatever like that. You wouldn't want that to happen. So this is kind of an example of something that's more fully featured. Here I can come in and add some data. Again, because it's iOS, typically the save button is in the top right. So we have that. That's just an option that's passed to the page window. I can say page, open page, the name of the page, options, give me a save button in the top right, have it call this function when it's clicked. Does that make sense?
So I know you're not using the drop-down menus that are now standard in iOS.
Yeah, we can switch it really easy. In our design, our designer didn't let. I guess but we can certainly add anything. And then, like I mentioned earlier, so that menu on the other app was built natively via the app menu native controller. In this particular case, I changed that to point to menu, the page called menu, which I created a menu.html for, which created this menu that I've styled according to our standards, added the appropriate iconography, and it works, according to how we'd want it to work. Does that make sense? And then, again, another feature, mapping. So clicking that launches native maps app, and you get all of those fine features. All right, any last minute questions before we're done? No? I'll be outside for a few minutes after this if anybody has any questions or wants to talk. Thanks.